150 years of the Civil War that occurred 150 years ago, beginning in 2011 of this year. And of course, Dr. Lovett, I think the last time we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to talk about the war itself. As I think you've indicated earlier, that many of our young people are not familiar with some of the great events that occurred in that war between 1861 and 1865. And so perhaps during this next 8 minutes, you could sort of highlight some of those events and tell why the war itself was significant.
Well, the war really begins with the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860. And December of 1860, when the Electoral College confirmed that Lincoln was the winner, South Carolina called for slave states to leave the Union. And South Carolina, Mississippi, and about 4 of the states had left the Union by February 1861. And they met at Montgomery, Alabama, and formed a separate country, the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis president in last of February 1861. Tennessee joined that rebellion in May of 1861 and joined the Confederacy in June of 1861. And mostly after South Carolina attacked the federal fort, Fort Sumter, in April of 1861. And Lincoln called for volunteers on the 15th of April to put down the rebellion and keep the Union together. As the war went on, of course, the major issue that had been an issue since the Constitutional Convention of 1787, slavery, of course, came to the forefront. And by 1862, Lincoln and Congress were convinced that they had to deal with that issue to save the Union. So in 1862, they declared slavery abolished in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. They had the power to do that. And then, secondly, they abolished slavery in any American territory, so no new states could come into the Union, and most of the territory of the United States was unsettled and were not organized into states. So they put a stop to that, and finally in summer of 1862, Lincoln decided and announced in September 22nd, 1862, that he was going to announce that all the slaves were free in any rebellious territory next January 1st, 1863.
Okay.
And on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation indeed was signed by President Lincoln at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon in the White House. That, of course, made the Confederates fight a little harder, but remember there were 15 slave states, and and 4 of those slave states did not join the rebellion, did not join the Confederacy. And so it was a contentious issue. Lincoln exempted those states
from the Emancipation
Proclamation, and he also exempted Tennessee and parts of Louisiana because they had been captured by the Union Army, and so all those territories that were under Union control, they were exempted. The only way we dealt with the rest of them was December the 18th, 1865. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution was finally approved by 3/5 of all the states, except 4 states that refused to ratify it, including the state of Mississippi, which finally ratified it, believe it or not, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. Mississippi finally ratified it in 1992. That long.
A few years after
a few years, more than a few years. They held out. Mississippi was, they held out until 1992. Nevertheless.
Well, they had the president, Jefferson Davis, and during the war.
Well, Mississippi played its role as a neo-Confederate state right up until the end of the 20th century. But the war, of course, did 2 or 3 things. One, as Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, who succeeded Lincoln as president, said, it freed whites in the South as much as it freed blacks.
Explain that. A lot of folks don't seem to understand that.
Well, what Johnson was really saying is, when the war started, 1 million Southerners out of 8 million were very, very poor. They didn't own any land. They had few possessions. They had no slaves, of course. And so when the war ended, it forced a redistribution of the land in the South, whereas only 20% of the people in the South owned slaves. In Tennessee, for example, they owned 57% of the best land. So they were filthy rich. But many Southerners were poor. 80% of them were not slave owners. And so when the war ended, it was much an emancipation of poor whites in the South as it was of blacks. Number two, of course, it abolished slavery, as you know. And then number three, of course, it settled the question whether states could succeed. That question was settled by the Civil War. No, because by violence they were brought back into the Union, and so we don't question that too much today. Although in the present movement of some states talking about states' rights and you know, hush-hush about they're going to succeed, interposition, and they're going to succeed from the Union. You know, just a lot of ignorant talk because the Civil War settled that question about whether the Union, once you're in it, you're in it. It's not like a marriage where you can get a divorce and come back in. So it did those three major things. It settled the question about secession and the Union. Number two, it abolished slavery. And then number three, it ordered a new biracial society in the South, whereas many whites too were liberated by the fact that slavery was abolished in the country.
And so, Dr. Lovett, as we come up to this second commercial, we can really say that the Emancipation Proclamation, as you indicated, not only liberated Africans and eventually the 13th Amendment, not only, but it also liberated a large number of whites as well.
That's correct.
So it was really a liberated movement throughout. But now, another thing that will happen in reference to this, when you talk about the commemoration, is to deal with those efforts on the part of some whites in the South to simply push Africans back into slavery and to deny some of the rights that they had received during the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Then we'll talk about the commemoration itself. Okay? And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. The guest is Dr.